My name is Peter Lee. I'm the honorary curator of the NUS Baba House. I've been involved in the development and the acquisition of the house by the university right from the very beginning. As the honorary curator, I helped to sort of design the visitor experience. It was my responsibility to deliver a product that is as authentic as possible and backed by a lot of historical research. And of course, I didn't work on this alone. It was a collaboration with NUS Museum, the Architectural Department of NUS, and the URA. The story of Peranakan migration to Singapore is old and very complex. The Chinese have been in Southeast Asia for a really long time, and they mostly came from Fujian and Guangdong, the two southern provinces of China. Now, what happened was, it was really difficult to travel at that time, and I think due to various circumstances and conditions, people moved out, poverty, the lure of riches, and they settled in sort of the Southeast Asian polities that were all over Indonesia, Thailand, and in Malaysia, in the old days, and as well as the colonial ports. So that's quite interesting, and they developed these networks all over. Malacca, of course, was one of the big centers, as well as Penang and Batavia, what is now Jakarta. So these were really key cities where Peranakans ended up. The connection, of course, is all the Malay world, Malay-speaking Chinese. The term Peranakan, of course, comes from Malay. So we are talking about community of Malay-speaking Chinese who came at least from 16th century, I would believe. And they settled in the kingdoms of the Malay world and in the colonial port cities. Many of them also had family and business links all over. So we are talking about maybe communities with relatives in Penang, Malacca, and Batavia, which is now Jakarta. So the early communities of Peranakans were in the Malay world mainly. So the port cities, especially Batavia, or what is now Jakarta, as well as Malacca, and even in Thailand, in Bangkok, in the early period. So there were like networks of Peranakans, and Malay was the lingua franca. Everybody spoke Malay. Whether you were Chinese or Arab or Indian, Malay was the main language. So that sort of formed the cultural foundation of all these communities. Now, the interesting thing, when Singapore was founded in 1819, the Chinese from all these networks rushed to Singapore as a land of opportunity. And why was that? The Chinese were involved in so many aspects of business and commerce. Whether you were just a laborer, building roads, carpenters, we also had businessmen, farmers, people involved in opium and all kinds of trade, textiles, traders of all kinds of materials. All these people rushed to Singapore because it was a free port. So, this is the interesting migration story, and we often forget how people came from everywhere. And this house, NUS Baba House in particular, tells the story very well. The founder of the family, Wee Bin, arrived in Singapore in the mid-19th century. He came as a really poor young man, but made it very quickly. I believe he probably married the daughter of his boss. Now, his boss came also from China. His name was Keong Kong Tuan. He moved to Penang and then somehow married a Malacca girl. And she came from one of the oldest families in Malacca, from the Chua family. So Wee Bin's wife had both sort of Penang and Malacca roots. Now that already shows you how complex Peranakan families formed. They had connections. This family, the Wee family had connections to Penang, Malacca, and China. Now, Wee Bin's son, Wee Bun Tek, we believe his wife, Ang Cheng Annyo, had some connection to Palembang. There is a family tradition, although we haven't been able to, confirm it, that she came from Palembang in Sumatra. Now, the neighborhood is also very interesting. It really reveals how diverse Peranakan origins were at that time. So, living on the same street, we had Lee Hun Leong, who was Lee Kuan Yew's grandfather. Lee Hun Leong came from Semarang. So we had Peranakans from Semarang on the street. There was another Semarang Peranakan called Go Bun Chan. He started the Ho Ho biscuit factory. So he lived on the same street. At the same time, we had Tan Beng Wan, who owned a shipping company, and he lived further down the street. His family came from Malacca. Why were they all on this neighborhood? Well, it was the proximity to the port. It was an easy sort of carriage ride to the port from here, and I believe that's the reason why these people connected to shipping chose this as a neighborhood. We also had Chua Kim Kiet, who came from Malacca. He was one of the business pioneers in the late 19th century. That just shows how diverse the Peranakan community was, even in one street. There's also another interesting fact about the neighborhood. The Wee family also owned the house behind 157 Neil Road, and this is number 20 Everton Road. The history of this area is not just about the Peranakan community, but other communities as well. At some point, maybe in the 20s or 30s, this house became a boarding house for the migrants from Pulau Bawean. These lodges were called pondoks, or in Baweanese itself, pontok. Chua Kim Kiet, who lived on the street, also built these garages on Everton Road. This was also where the Baweanese community might have left their vehicles before moving upstairs, where there were also lodges. So if you imagine, every household would have brought their own sets of traditions. It warns us not to really think of the community as being very standardized. What people ate, how they practiced their customs would all have been different from house to house, even on one street. The treasures in Baba House also have their stories, and many of them give us clues about where they came from, the migration stories. So for example, the bed. When I first saw the bed, I was really astounded because it's really rare to see a Malacca-style bed. Most Peranakan families in Singapore just have a single bridal bed. Here, we have the pair. Now this is something you only see in Malacca. So what does that tell us about this family? We know that Wee Bin's mother-in-law came from Malacca. So this might have been inherited by Wee Bin's wife and then down through the family, just maybe, because why else would a Malacca bed be here in Singapore? So what is a Malacca bed? You know, they come in pairs. There's a smaller kind of settee or bed at the front and the sort of main big bed at the back, four-poster. Typical Southern Chinese work, probably carved locally though. So in this case, we clearly see a connection from Malacca to Singapore through several generations. That's quite a special story. These beds are so old, and there are not many people alive who can actually remember and tell us how they were used. So the Malacca bed is unique because it has a single bed in the front and a double bed at the back. Now the single bed at the front is sort of like a settee as well. And there are many traditions about what it was actually used for. Some have said that it would be where the bride and groom would sit down and formally meet each other. Others have suggested that it would be the place where a young mother would nurse her newborn baby. The double bed is fascinating. It has secret drawers. It even had a display shelf for fine objects. We have to remember that this was a wedding bed. So part of the wedding ceremony was held in the bedroom, and it would have been displayed with gorgeous hangings and silver curtain hooks. So the shelf would have been an opportunity for it to be shown off in a very grand way. So what's also fascinating is the name of the bed. It's called a Ranjang Loksan. So this is half Malay, half Chinese. Ranjang is bed in Malay, and Loksan is anybody's guess. Nobody really knows what it means. Together, it refers to the bridal bed. So here again, we have a little hint about migration and origins, language and peoples coming together to create a new word. The fact that the wedding bed has such a hybrid term is a clue to the entire wedding ceremony, which was equally hybrid. The foundation of it, of course, was a very old Chinese-style ceremony. But by the 20th century, there were so many elements that were clearly local. Practices that might have come from the Malay community, from Malay weddings that were incorporated all together. For example, the ceremony would involve the use of betel nut, sireh. So this is a really Malay element that had sort of been completely incorporated into the wedding. Other elements were equally hybrid, even when they came from China. So there are these particular kind of wedding baskets that were lacquered. They were imported from Fujian, from a town called Yongchun, which is where my ancestors came from. Now these we call bakul sia. So again, it's a hybrid term. So we have bakul, which is basket in Malay, and sia, which is a very old Hokkien term for a basket as well. So it's basket, but in Malay and Hokkien combined together. These were really essential kind of ceremonial items for the wedding. Best examples of these baskets are really elaborate, lacquered with gold leaf, and some of them even have sort of like stucco or plaster ornaments and symbols all around them. These elaborate bakul sias were used for various purposes for the wedding. They would have been used as part of the exchange of gifts for the wedding, so they would have been stacked full of jewels, maybe. They were also used for the exchange of food between families. That was kind of a sort of gesture of goodwill between both sides of the family. At certain points, food might have been sent back and forth. I believe it was an understanding, though, that you had to return the bakul sia back to the family. It wasn't yours to keep. Now, the family has also something quite unique. It's called a tenong. It's a lacquered box, a stacked lacquer box, kind of lotus-shaped. These are really rare for Peranakan families. There are maybe just a few families that have them. By tradition, the Wee family believes that Mrs. Wee Boon Teck, whose name was Ang Cheng Anyo, came from Palembang. We know of some Peranakan families that have links to Palembang. Could be a matriarch that came from there. We also know from the huge amounts of Palembang lacquer objects that there was this very good trade coming between Palembang and Singapore. So that's also a very interesting story. Palembang is a fascinating place with a really, really old Chinese community. Even from Admiral Cheng Ho's time in the 15th century, we know there was already a Peranakan community there. So the Chinese influence in that city, creating these really hybrid sort of Chinese-Malay objects, have been around for centuries. And the fact that the family has it here is sort of a sign of this sort of lineage and connection to Palembang. At some point, Peranakans from Palembang were moving to Singapore. And this is sort of a little clue. What is really nice, we have the original tenongs that belong to the Wee family, as well as really fine examples sourced from other places, with all the gold leaf still intact. They are just magnificent objects, so beautifully done, and so little is known about them. Palembang lacquer is as mixed up as Peranakans. When you look at a piece, you will see elements that are really Chinese and sometimes not. And I believe that the workshops really had a mixture of people. Palembang Malays, you could have Chinese craftsmen as well, and maybe sometimes they worked on the same piece together. And so you might see a qilin together with some Islamic motifs. So it's really fascinating. Sometimes they're more Chinese, sometimes they're less. And again, it reminds us that this area, what's unique is that we are really diverse and we are really not standardized. Even within one type of craft, you see so much variety. The tenong is made up of several parts and they're all loose. They're basically two boxes that can be dismantled. I'm sure there's a symbolism in the number of pieces that they comprise, but we don't really know. I've asked so many people. It is such an ancient craft and object that its use is completely lost. And that's the tragedy. Even the Wee family have no recollection of what these boxes were used for. But the general consensus, though, is that they were used as part of the wedding and to store dowry objects. Could be textiles, it could be all kinds of treasures that the bride would take to her new house. Another fascinating migration story can be found in something in the bedroom. Now this would be the hairpin. These are called korek kuping. Even the term itself tells us a bit about where Peranakans came from. Korek kuping literally means ear digger. The word for ear used by the Peranakan community is kuping. Now this is interesting because Malays in Singapore would use the word telinga. Kuping is something you would hear in Java. So linguistically, we have these terms in Baba Malay that come from Javanese. Similarly, the word for crab, in Malay you say ketam. Peranakans would use the word kepiting, which is again the more common term that you would hear in Indonesia and Java. So the language itself has a story about where Peranakans came from, the migration of language as well. So these Javanese terms in Baba Malay tell us a bit about, where we came from. But now when we come to the form of it, these ear diggers have a very old Chinese origin. Worn in a set of 3 always. The term for them are Sanggononia Tiga Batang. It's always a set of 3. And of course the nickname for them is amusing. They're also called coffin nails because they really look like they would have been worn in sets of 3. I love this particular set. It's really tarnished and it has a feel of really being used. I'm just imagining the amount of coconut oil that would have been used to slick the hair, and aloe vera as well. Must have stained these beautiful old hairpins. Every family would have their story about these hairpins. So, of course, they would have been used by the old ladies to whack the kids. I've also heard stories where maids have, sought revenge on their mistresses by stabbing their heads a little too hard by accident. This is one way to sort of like get back at your boss. And also, interestingly, they have these arrow-shaped ends. Now, these are fascinating. Arrow-shaped ends are interesting because when we compare them to a Sri Lankan version, you see that they have the very same finials at the end. In those days, many of the goldsmiths were from Sri Lanka. So it also tells us of another kind of migration of traders and jewelers who moved from town to town. So we had Sri Lankan jewelers, we had Chinese jewelers, and all of them made jewelry for the Peranakans. So again, we see this huge confusing variety of objects, even within a segment of a category of objects, for example, jewelry. They could be made by a whole range of people and might be quite similar and alike, but not the same. And this confusion is really part of Peranakan material culture. I think it's really wonderful how the house, the neighborhood, the lineage of the family, and just picking up a few objects show us the range of places that Peranakans came from. The migration story is so strong just within this house. There are many, many more stories in every object you can just imagine, and I really hope that visitors can come and experience it for themselves.